Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, behind an Israeli warning that international prosecution may be looming,
Israeli officials fear the International Criminal Court may issue arrest warrants for senior members of government, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu may be on the list.
So what would legal action mean for Israel? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Al Jazeera's Hamdah Salhut is on the ground in Tel Aviv. She's been following these recent warnings, suggesting that International Criminal Court arrest warrants might be in the works for some of Israel's most senior leaders.
Israeli officials have been speaking about this at length, including Israel's Foreign Minister Israel Katz and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
No ICC action will impact Israel's ironclad determination to achieve the goals of our war with Hamas terrorists. We will destroy Hamas's military and governing capabilities in Gaza. We will release all our hostages, and we will ensure that Gaza never poses a threat to Israel again.
Now, the Israeli Prime Minister has said that this would, quote, be an outrage of historical proportions, saying that the International Court is trying to put Israel on the dock as Israel continues its war on Gaza.
We reached out to an international law expert to help us learn more about ICC prosecution and its impact on Israel.
Hi, I'm Mark Kersten. I'm an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of the Fraser Valley. My work focuses on human rights law and the prosecution of international crimes, so war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
Which is why we have you here. So talk to me about what that looks like for you when you get a breaking news alert on your phone and it says something like Israeli officials warn of potential warrants.
It's about time. You know, I'm not new to this game. I've been working in this field and studying this field for a long time. Israel and Palestine isn't the only situation where people like me, and in particular, victims and survivors and advocates, are a little bit impatient for something to finally happen on the justice and accountability front. I'm one of those people who believes that this conflict continues to happen because there's such a massive denial of accountability and a production of shame constantly against civilians on all sides of this conflict. For me, it's about time. And when people like, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are worried, I think we're doing the right thing.
So we know that the ICC has been investigating possible crimes in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank since 2021. And we now know that Israeli officials are concerned. But to understand why that matters, we have to start with who is and who isn't in the ICC. Palestine is a member of the ICC. Israel is not and doesn't recognize the court's jurisdiction. So what difference does this make?
Yeah, such an important question. And I know that sometimes it can get kind of lost in legal mumbo jumbo, but I think there is a relatively simple way to understand this. So first of all, for the purposes of the International Criminal Court, it doesn't really matter how many states recognize Palestinian statehood. We know now that across the world, 142 do. And then there's those that don't, primarily Europe, the country that I'm in right now, Canada, the United States. But for the International Criminal Court, all that really matters is that the ICC itself recognizes that Palestine is a state for the purposes of the International Criminal Court, which, as you rightly mentioned, means it can investigate on the territory that is Palestine. Now, you also noted that the ICC's been investigating since 2021. It opened its investigation in 2019, but what it had to do then, the prosecutor at the time, is basically figure out what is Palestine, right? Because there's been questions for decades as to what exactly Palestine is. Where does Palestine stop? Where does it end? Which parts are Palestinian? Which parts are not Palestinian? And the judges came back in 2021 and basically said, look, we believe that Palestine as a state before the International Criminal Court is made up of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So that means that despite the fact that Israeli officials and the IDF, etc., are citizens of a state, Israel, that is not a member state of the ICC can investigate and prosecute those crimes because they're happening on the state of Palestine. It also means that any citizen of Palestine can be investigated by the ICC, which is important for October 7th because it's very likely that the ICC prosecutor will issue arrest warrants in the coming days or weeks for Hamas perpetrators whose atrocities were committed in Israel, which again is the territory of a state that is not party to the ICC. But because they're Palestinian, the ICC can exercise their jurisdiction. An easier way perhaps to kind of figure this out is, look, we're having this conversation around Israel-Palestine for political reasons, but no one doubts that when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, that it was somehow wrong for the ICC to investigate Vladimir Putin, even though Vladimir Putin is the president of a country that is not a member state of the ICC.
The International Criminal Court in The Hague has issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin. In a statement, the ICC said the warrant is in connection with allegations of war crimes in Ukraine.
It would make no sense if states could join the ICC, but then citizens of other countries could come in and commit atrocities, and the ICC would be like, oh, well, we can't actually do anything about this. We can only investigate those who accepted the jurisdiction. No, that doesn't protect anyone.
Right. Otherwise, it would make the ICC pretty toothless. So that makes sense. Given all that, though, the flip side is that the ICC has given no indication that warrants for Israeli officials or Hamas officials are imminent, and it's made no comment on the claims. When asked about these media reports of the arrest warrants, the ICC told NBC News that it, quote, has an ongoing independent investigation in relation to the situation in the state of Palestine. So then why the concern?
So it's an interesting point. So first of all, totally makes sense that the ICC prosecutor is not talking about arrest warrants. We shouldn't really know whether the ICC is going to issue arrest warrants at any given time because it's a highly confidential and sensitive process. The question then arises is, why is Israel afraid of something that the ICC hasn't actually done yet? I think it comes down to the fact that they know that something is coming. I've written about this before. Just like the United Nations and other countries, etc., the ICC just isn't immune to espionage and intelligence gathering, right? And that is something that we all know Israel is very, very adept at. I think it's just pretty clear that they got whiff of something coming down the pipeline and shared it internally. Whether or not they're getting it right, I don't know. You know, intelligence doesn't always get it exactly right, but it's enough that it caused what seems like mayhem and nervousness and a certain level of hysteria among senior Israeli politicians. And in my view, that doesn't happen if there's no point whatsoever.
After the break, U.S. lawmakers are warning the ICC that arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials will be met with U.S. retaliation. So, Mark, we know that this isn't the beginning of the ICC's involvement in Israel-Palestine. It launched a probe 3 years ago, we mentioned, into possible war crimes committed by Israel and Palestinian fighters. And Israel's construction of illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank was also tied up in that. And there was fallout from that eventually. The Trump administration imposed sanctions against the International Criminal Court in 2020 in coordination with Israel. So the fallout wasn't great. Could it happen again?
Okay, so the fallout wasn't great. But on the other hand, I think it did do something, which is if Donald Trump is going to have this massive hissy fit over the ICC's work abroad, if you have this massive disproportionate reaction, it also does something important, and I think is actually good, which it says the ICC is doing the right thing. Because if people like Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu are worried about the ICC, that means that the ICC is doing its work without fear or favor from, politicians or states that would otherwise happily threaten it and interfere with it. And I think it's actually quite an important story to highlight that you're absolutely right. There was coordinated sanctions against the ICC prosecutor. There was various kinds of threats to the ICC prosecutor, and indeed, crazily enough, to their families from the United States. And the ICC is still investigating the situation in Palestine. So they stood their ground and they withstood that kind of political interference. Do I think that that will happen again? Yes. I think if you look at Twitter and all the kind of Congress people and senators, both Democratic and Republican, again, they are making, very extreme claims about the ICC. There's suggestions that this would be a fatal blow to the ICC. So basically threatening the ICC with that it might not even exist if it continues to do this, that they'll sanction it.
Wow.
Behind the scenes, I think, are actually the more important threats. I know that the ICC constantly on this situation faces threats from states, whether it's to pull funding or for states to, reduce their levels of cooperation and support of the ICC. It's a really big moment for the court because it's never really done anything on this scale. It is about time, but it's also a really tough thing to do, to go after the leaders of a state that have so much support. What I do hope, and what we haven't seen, unfortunately, I think so far, is we haven't seen states that do support the ICC and its investigation stand up and say, hey, if anybody's threatening the court right now, they should stop doing this. They don't have a right to interfere with the ICC. And I'd really like to see that, right? Hopefully they do that. Of course, whether they do that publicly matters. It also just simply also matters whether they're communicating that in private to the prosecutor, that they'll support and stand by whatever the prosecutor decides. And they don't have to like it. No one should like the fact that we're in a situation where arrest warrants are necessary right now. I think back quite often on what the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, had said repeatedly in October and then again in February on something like the denial of aid into Gaza.
Any crimes committed on the territory of Palestine, impeding relief supplies, as provided by the Geneva Conventions, may constitute a crime within the court's jurisdiction. And I want to underline clearly to Israel that there must be discernible efforts without further delay to make sure civilians receive basic food, medicine, anesthetics, morphine.
He said, look, this aid, medical aid, clean water, food has to come in. And if it doesn't, that is a war crime under my jurisdiction.
Wow.
And if it doesn't come in, if this situation does not change, do not be surprised if you basically force my hand into issuing arrest warrants. In February, he basically called Israel out. He said, look, I haven't seen enough change in behavior. I told you in October that not enough aid was going in, that this was going to create a massive humanitarian crisis. You didn't listen. If you don't change, don't act surprised later if I have to issue arrest warrants.
Laws of war must be respected. They can't be rendered hollow. They can't be interpreted so as to void them of meaning or to dilute or eviscerate any protective purpose that the Geneva Conventions and the law provides the most vulnerable children, women, people that are sick, or civilians. They must be interpreted with full protection.
So states don't have to like that this is happening. All they have to do is respect that the only independent, credible investigation into these atrocities right now is happening at the ICC. And they should all, in my view, especially democracies around the world, side with the fact that accountability matters, that justice matters, and that anything that suggests otherwise is such a flagrant insult to victims and survivors in Israel and Palestine.
So then I wonder for you, if you could explain to people who hear that and who think justice does matter, Why then it seems like there is an exception when it comes to Israel, at least with the United States. You mentioned the U.S. lawmakers who are threatening action against the ICC. They're not the only ones. The Biden administration also does not support the ICC's investigation into Israel's actions in Gaza. But in the past, the U.S. has welcomed actions by this court against countries like Russia. So there's a little bit of a conundrum here. What power does the U.S. actually have to stop prosecutions from happening in cases where it wants to stop them?
None. I mean, technically none. It can try, and it is trying, and it has tried before, but it theoretically has none. As I said before, the United States isn't even a member state of the International Criminal Court. One of the most absurd facts about international criminal law and the ICC is that the state that has tried to influence and affect the ICC the most in its history has been a non-member state.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just remarkable. And look, I think I agree with those people who say, look, I really hope that one day the United States just joins the ICC, is bound to the ICC. But until then, we have a state that, as you pointed out, sometimes likes the ICC's work and sometimes doesn't.
So say these arrest warrants are issued. What would they entail? What would officials be charged with?
I think if we're looking at Hamas, it's not that difficult because Hamas attacks are inherently and explicitly indiscriminate. So I actually think it's not very difficult to build cases against Hamas perpetrators under international humanitarian law, which is the kind of legal regime that governs war crimes. So those cases should be relatively easy. Mm-hmm. On the Israeli side, I think it's actually a little bit more difficult. It's really important to note that the ICC cannot investigate in Gaza on the ground or in Israel because Israel will not allow it to. And so that will create certain limitations, right? So what I think actually, and I mean, I could be wrong, but I think the ICC will focus on kind of policy-driven crimes at first. So, for example, the denial of aid or the intentional starvation of Gazans, that is something that the ICC can investigate without actually going into Gaza.
Final question, Mark. Say these arrest warrants are issued against these individuals, because of course that's what the ICC does. What effect will that actually have in Gaza? Will it change anything on the ground?
I hope so. I really hope so. I don't think, look, it will not bring peace to Gaza or the West Bank. What I do hope that it signals, for the first time ever, is that an international court believes you. Believes that what happened to you was awful. And not just awful, and not just, as we hear so often, tragic, but criminal in nature. That the only permanent international court created to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, as imperfect as that court may be, believes that the victims and survivors have experienced something unlawful. And even if the arrest warrants aren't immediately enforced, and even if someone like Netanyahu doesn't end up at the ICC in the next coming months or years, there's justice in the process of pursuing justice.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Sarí el-Khalili, Khaled Soltan, and Sonia Bhagat, with Negin Auliai, Chloe Cayley, Manahil Naveed, Tamara Kandakar, Catherine Nouhan, Ashish Malhotra, David Enders, Amy Walters, Zainab Bezer, Fahrinisa Campana, and me, Malika Bilal. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Joe Plourde mixed this episode. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back.